Just before dawn on June 6, 1944, deep inside a concrete casemate overlooking Omaha Beach, Obergefreiter Heinrich Wolf pressed his gloved hand against the bunker wall and felt the cold solidity of the Atlantic wall beneath his fingertips. It was a silent reassurance that the fortress of Europe could not be broken. For months, Wolf and his comrades had been told the same message in training manuals, propaganda films, and officers' speeches. Die Atlantikwall ist uneinhimmbar. The Atlantic Wall is impregnable. They believed it. How could they not? The bunkers around them were carved from reinforced concrete over 2 meters thick. Their firing slits were angled to survive direct hits. Their ceilings had been poured in multiple layers, each designed to resist naval shells. Machine gun nests were embedded like steel teeth facing the sea. Barbed wire sprawled across the shoreline like a metallic forest. Mines waited under sand so deep that explosions felt like thunder contained in earth. And behind every defense, ammunition racks filled the shadows. Wolf had seen the diagrams. He had watched the demonstrations. He had heard the promises repeated by officers who spoke with absolute certainty. The Tommies can try. The Yankees can try. Let them come. The wall will hold. Even Rommel's own warnings about Allied air power and naval guns had been dismissed by many lower-ranking officers as pessimism. The wall was strong, the concrete was stronger, and the morale of its defenders, many of them young, poorly supplied, but deeply convinced, was strongest of all. But at 05:10 that morning, the myth of the Atlantic Wall began to tremble. At first, Wolf heard only a distant rumble, like a storm gathering over the sea. He leaned into the bunker's firing slit and saw nothing but darkness. Then the horizon flashed white, and another flash, and another. Dozens at once, dozens more behind them. Then the sound arrived. It was not noise. It was not thunder. It was impact, a physical force that punched through the body before reaching the ears. The bunker shook as if grabbed by an invisible hand. Dust rained from the ceiling. The steel bolts in the gun embrasure groaned like tortured metal. The naval bombardment had begun. The first shells struck the cliffs, then the beach obstacles, then the casemates along the line. The ground heaved. The sea erupted in plumes 30 meters high. Bunkers that had felt eternal now vibrated like drums struck by Olympic giants. Wolf shouted orders, but his own voice was devoured by the roar of naval guns firing from battleships miles offshore. Ships the Germans had been assured could never approach the coast without being sunk by coastal batteries. Yet there they were, USS Texas, USS Arkansas, HMS Warspite, French cruisers, destroyers, escort ships, an entire floating arsenal unleashing fire with mechanical precision. The shells were not random, they were methodical, target by target, plotted by Allied observers in the air, incrementally adjusting, zeroing in. Wolf felt the walls shake again, harder this time. A crack zigzagged across the ceiling. Concrete dust poured down like gray snowfall. Someone screamed. It was not the fear of death that shocked Wolf. It was the fear of impossible things happening. He pressed his shoulder against the bunker's support pillar as another blast struck. The entire casemate lurched sideways. Pieces of rebar came loose from the ceiling like skeletal ribs exposed by a wound. In the flickering emergency light, Wolf stared in disbelief as the indestructible walls he had trusted began to chip, fracture, and erode, like sand, like something fragile pretending to be strong. He struggled to reconcile what he saw with everything he'd been told. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to withstand any naval bombardment for hours, days even, until counterattacks arrived. But the naval guns were not firing like the manuals described. They weren't firing occasional, inaccurate shots. They were firing continuously, rhythmically, devastatingly. A storm of steel raining on a coastline that had never been tested in real war. An artilleryman beside Wolf shouted, "It's impossible. Bunkers don't break like this." But the cracks widening in the ceiling said otherwise. Outside, machine gun nests were ripped open. Observation posts were crushed under avalanches of dirt. Entire casemates disappeared under direct hits from 14-inch battleship shells, each weighing over half a metric ton, striking with the force of gods driving hammers into stone. As the shelling intensified, something in Wolf's mind began to fracture alongside the concrete. The impregnable wall was not holding. It was being carved apart, cut open, pulverized. The myth that had shielded his confidence was collapsing under the weight of reality. The psychological break spread through the defenders like a silent contagion. How could we fight an enemy who turns concrete into sand? How do we survive what the structure cannot? Some soldiers clung to their weapons, trembling. Others crouched under structural beams, praying. Others shouted through the smoke, demanding orders that could no longer be heard. Panic began to seep into the corners of the bunker like cold air. At 0620, a shell struck so close that the bunker seemed to lift off the ground. The world turned white. When Wolf's vision cleared, he saw daylight. Daylight where the reinforced wall had been. A massive breach opened on the seaward side. The Atlantic wind tore through it, scattering dust and debris. That was the moment the defenders understood the truth. Whatever they believed the Atlantic Wall to be, whatever they had been promised, it was not enough. Omaha Beach had not yet been stormed. The infantry had not yet landed. The battle had not yet begun, and already the wall was dying. This is the story of that collapse. The moment the German soldiers who guarded the Atlantic Wall discovered that their confidence rested not on engineering, not on concrete, and not on doctrine, but on a myth that naval fire shattered in minutes. Long before the first Allied ships appeared on the horizon of Normandy, long before the naval guns thundered and the bunkers cracked, a different kind of structure had already been built inside the minds of the Atlantic Wall's defenders. It was not made of reinforced concrete or steel girders or angled embrasures. It was made of belief. Belief that the wall could not fall. Belief that engineering could replace manpower. Belief that concrete could hold back an ocean. Belief that fear itself could be engineered into a weapon. This psychological fortification was, in many ways, stronger than the physical one. And it was precisely that invisible structure, constructed over years of propaganda, doctrine, and ritual, that shattered so violently on the morning of June 6th. To understand the collapse the German soldiers experienced at Omaha Beach, one must first understand why they were so certain the wall would hold. By 1943, with the Eastern Front bleeding the Wehrmacht dry, and Allied bombers hammering the Reich night after night, Hitler needed a symbol, something that could reassure both his soldiers and his civilians that Germany was still invincible. The Atlantic Wall became that symbol. Stretching over 2,400 miles from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, it was advertised as the largest defensive project in history. 15,000 bunkers, millions of tons of concrete, huge artillery casemates, minefields blankets, machine gun nests embedded in the coastline, interlocking arcs of fire. For the men stationed there, many of them older conscripts, foreign battalions, or exhausted veterans, the wall was more than a posting. It was a psychological guarantee, a fortress that compensated for their lack of manpower, their lack of mobility, and their lack of strategic reserves. Officers told their units, again and again, "No enemy can break the wall. Our defenses are too deep, too thick, too well constructed." Even the designations reinforced the myth. Defensive positions were given fortress-like names: Stützpunkt, Widerstandsnest, Stützpunktgruppe. The vocabulary itself implied strength, permanence, security. Propaganda films portrayed the wall as a modern Maginot Line, invincible, immovable, eternal. And soldiers believed it. For a soldier like Obergefreiter Heinrich Wolf, the Atlantic Wall was a kind of secular church. Its pillars were made of reinforced concrete, its sanctuary the observation rooms and firing slits, where he stared out over the English Channel. He trusted the wall's strength the way a sailor trusts the hull of a battleship. The thought of it failing was unthinkable. Its thickness and weight were beyond human comprehension. A single bunker often contained 3,000 cubic feet of concrete, enough to build a small apartment block. Engineers told the troops that Allied naval guns could not possibly penetrate such density. Soldiers knocked on the walls with their knuckles and heard the solid, lifeless thud of something too heavy to be harmed. They joked that if the world ended, these bunkers would remain. Concrete became a psychological anchor. It reassured them when supply lines were thin. It reassured them when they heard rumors of Allied fleets building in Britain. It reassured them when they listened to the distant echo of bombs falling on the Reich. Concrete was the thing that would not break, or so they believed. But belief alone was not enough. The defenders were trained to see their positions not as bunkers, but as kill zones designed to channel and annihilate an attacker. Their tactical manuals reinforced the promise of impregnability. The approach to the beach was heavily mined. The beach obstacles were designed to tear landing craft apart. Machine gun fields of fire overlapped in deadly geometries. Anti-tank guns were recessed and camouflaged. Every inch of sand was registered by pre-plotted artillery fire. Germany had built a defensive machine that assumed the enemy would be funneled into predictable patterns and destroyed. This doctrine bred confidence. Confidence bred certainty. Certainty replaced doubt. Many soldiers stationed at Omaha went months without seeing combat. They watched the tides. They memorized firing solutions. They polished their weapons. Their world narrowed to firing arcs and embrasures. The wall became their identity. Waiting in war is its own kind of conditioning. For months leading up to D-Day, Wolfe and his comrades waited behind their thick walls, convinced that when the invasion came, it would smash harmlessly against the concrete, like waves against a cliff. The longer they waited, the stronger the myth became. Every uneventful sunrise reinforced the idea that the wall was enough. Every inspection from higher officers emphasized its impregnability. Every rumor of Allied buildup in Britain was met with a shrug. Let them come. We are ready. But readiness built on reassurance is fragile. When reality arrives, loud, violent, and undeniable, it crushes not just the body, but the mind. The great psychological flaw in German thinking was simple. They believed their bunkers had been designed to withstand naval bombardment. And in a narrow technical sense, this was partly true. Many bunkers could survive occasional shelling. Some could resist indirect fire. But no one, not Rommel, not the coastal engineers, not the officers commanding the Atlantic Wall, had experienced or imagined a bombardment like the one that arrived on the morning of June 6th. The Americans and British did not fire occasionally. They fired continuously, systematically, with naval guns of colossal caliber, 14-inch guns, 15-inch guns, 6-inch cruiser shells, and destroyers firing so rapidly that their barrels glowed. These were weapons designed to crack battleships. Now they were targeting bunkers. A German soldier who had never seen such firepower could not imagine it. It was like trying to imagine the weight of an ocean from a bucket of water. Thus, the first cracks in the bunker walls on D-Day were not just physical, they were the cracks in a worldview. When the first shells hit Omaha's coastal bunkers, the defenders expected them to bounce off, to explode harmlessly on the exterior, to leave nothing but scorch marks. Instead, they felt the ground heave, the ceiling shake, the steel braces groan, the concrete crack. The disbelief was immediate and collective. This cannot be happening. The walls are too thick. The engineers said, the wall is supposed to survive this. But walls do not care what men believe. Concrete does not respect doctrine. Physics does not obey propaganda. The Atlantic Wall had been built on a foundation of engineering assumptions. The men inside it had built their faith on those assumptions. And when the shells of Allied battleships began turning bunkers into open wounds in the coastline, something fundamental shattered inside the minds of the defenders. Omaha Beach had not yet seen a single landing craft touch the sand, and already the defenders had begun to understand a horrifying truth. The wall was not impregnable. It had never been impregnable. It had only been unproven, and when put to the ultimate test, it cracked like sand. When the first Allied shells crashed onto Omaha Beach, most German defenders had no framework, no mental category, with which to understand what was happening to them. They expected naval bombardment, yes, but not this kind, not this scale, not this precision, and certainly not this devastating cumulative effect that turned reinforced concrete into something brittle, fragile, and mortal. For decades, naval gunnery had been a distant, abstract concept for land forces. Most Atlantic Wall soldiers had never seen a battleship up close. They knew the statistics on paper, the weight of a shell, the range of a gun, the thickness of armor such rounds were meant to penetrate. But they had never witnessed a battleship firing at land targets with nothing restraining its fury. The morning of D-Day was their first encounter with that reality. It was also their last illusion. To understand the psychological collapse experienced by the defenders at Omaha, we must first understand the physics, the geometry, and the overwhelming mass of naval fire that shattered their assumptions. For the naval bombardment on June 6th was not simply destructive, it was transformational. It altered the battlefield, the defenses, and the minds of the men inside them. Off the coast of Normandy lay some of the most powerful naval vessels ever built, floating fortresses of steel, whose guns were designed to sink armored warships at 20 miles. On D-Day, these guns turned their attention to land, delivering firepower that few armies on Earth had ever experienced. Consider the opening salvo from the battleship USS Texas. Her main battery consisted of 14-inch guns, each firing a shell weighing over 635 kilograms. These shells did not simply explode, they obliterated. They traveled at supersonic speed. They carried enough kinetic energy to crush concrete. They detonated with force equivalent to small aerial bombs. They sent shock waves through earth and stone alike. A single hit could tear open a bunker, designed to withstand artillery. A near miss could destabilize structural foundations. Multiple hits, delivered in precise sequence, could reduce reinforced concrete to fractured debris. And Texas was only one ship. Nearby, USS Arkansas, HMS Warspite, HMS Ramillies, and multiple cruisers added their own shells to the storm. Their combined fire created a pattern of destruction that the German defenders had never imagined. The guns fired in overlapping cycles, ensuring that every few seconds, another massive explosion shook the coastline. The Atlantic Wall had never endured such a test. It was not built to. If battleships were the hammers of the bombardment, the destroyers were the scalpels, fast, agile, and terrifyingly accurate. Buildings could hide from artillery, bunkers could withstand indirect fire, but nothing could hide from a destroyer willing to come dangerously close to shore. The destroyers at Omaha performed one of the most daring actions of D-Day. As infantry floundered under German machine gun fire, destroyers like USS Satterley, USS McCook, and HMS Taliban sped toward the beach, closing distance until they were barely 900 meters offshore. At that range, their 5-inch guns could fire with pinpoint accuracy. They could target individual bunkers. They could see muzzle flashes inside German positions. They could adjust fire in real time. Each shell they fired weighed 25 kilograms, not enormous, but deadly when delivered with surgical precision into embrasures or ventilation shafts. More importantly, they fired rapidly, up to 20 rounds per minute, creating a percussive rhythm of destruction that shook German fortifications like repeated blows from a chisel. To the men inside the bunkers, the effect was horrifying. A single hit might not destroy a casemate outright, but dozens of coordinated hits? They carved concrete like stone cutters, wearing down a slab. One German NCO later described it. The bunker did not break all at once. It disintegrated. It crumbled like something drying out under heat. Every hit removed a piece. Every shockwave stole strength. It was like watching your own shelter turn to sand. Reinforced concrete is strong when struck once. It is far less strong when struck repeatedly. The Atlantic Wall was designed to withstand isolated shells, not prolonged bombardment. Its builders assumed Allied naval vessels would be kept at distance by coastal batteries. They assumed that any bombardment would be brief, inaccurate, and limited to perimeter damage. They did not imagine hundreds of shells per hour, coordinated fire from multiple ships, direct hits on casemates, sustained bombardment lasting nearly 2 hours. Naval shells did not simply break concrete, they destabilized it. Shock waves traveled through the structure. Rebar bent under cyclical stress. Microfractures formed along seams and joints. Dust cascaded down like falling ash, choking defenders. Load-bearing walls began to shear. For the defenders, this process was terrifying precisely because it was gradual. The bunker did not explode, it slowly failed, piece by piece, layer by layer, confidence collapsing with each tremor. Concrete is supposed to stand still. On D-Day, it moved, it vibrated, it shuddered, it cracked, it shifted on its foundations. For men who had been told that their bunkers were immovable, the movement of concrete produced a kind of existential terror, the realization that the very thing meant to protect them was beginning to betray them. Imagine a submarine creaking under crushing pressure. Imagine an airplane's wing cracking in flight. Imagine a tank's armor buckling from within. That was the bunker at Omaha Beach. A fortress that was not supposed to move, moving. A wall that was not supposed to crack, cracking. A myth that was not supposed to break, breaking. And through the dust and smoke, the rumble of naval guns never stopped. One German gunner wrote in his diary, "The walls were bleeding concrete. That is when I knew the wall was a lie." Naval fire did not simply destroy structures, it destroyed the ability to function. Rangefinders were smashed, radios went silent, periscopes shattered, ammunition stores ignited, ventilation systems clogged. Commanders inside the bunkers were blinded, deafened, and suffocating. Outside, trenches were collapsing. Telephone lines snapped like twine. Secondary positions disappeared into plumes of dust. The defenders were not fighting. They were surviving, and not well. For most German defenders, the moment the Atlantic Wall died was not when the first breach appeared, nor when the first bunker collapsed. It was the moment they realized the bombardment wasn't stopping, that the ships were firing accurately, that they were adjusting fire intelligently, that they were coordinating across miles of sea, that every blast was part of a pattern. The wall was not being tested, it was being dismantled. Psychologically, this was the breaking point. The moment disbelief became fear, the moment fear became helplessness, the moment helplessness became collapse. The naval bombardment on Omaha Beach did not simply destroy bunkers, it destroyed the idea of them, the idea of impregnability, the idea of fortress warfare, the idea of German invulnerability. A myth died under the weight of naval shells. And when the bombardment finally lifted and the first landing craft approached the beach, many German defenders were no longer the soldiers they had been at dawn. Their weapons remained, their positions remained, but something inside them had already broken. The concrete had cracked, and so had their certainty. When the naval guns finally ceased firing on the early morning of June 6th, a strange, eerie silence settled momentarily over the bluffs above Omaha Beach. It was not peace. It was the breath drawn between two phases of destruction, the bombardment that shattered the Atlantic Wall and the landing waves that would exploit its fractures. Inside the surviving German positions, soldiers emerged from clouds of pulverized concrete like ghosts, coughing, bleeding, disoriented. But what mattered most at this moment was not the physical damage to the bunkers, though many were cracked or half collapsed. What mattered was the breakdown of coherence, the invisible structure that kept a defensive system functioning: communication, coordination, command hierarchy, firing discipline, and psychological stability. The German defenders at Omaha Beach had not been annihilated by the bombardment, but they had been unmade by it. Their ability to fight as a coordinated force dissolved before the first American soldier set foot on the sand. To understand why Omaha Beach became such a brutal struggle, and why German resistance was simultaneously fierce yet fundamentally broken, we must examine the collapse of defensive coherence, the moment when a fortified system ceased to be a system at all. The Atlantic Wall's strength depended not on individual bunkers, but on their integration. Observation posts called in ranges, artillery adjusted based on visual spotting, commanders shifted units along the line to plug breaches, machine gun nests coordinated crossfire. The naval bombardment destroyed this web in minutes. Field phones went silent. Signal wires snapped from concussive force. Radio aerials were blown off. Runners could not move through collapsing trenches. Command posts lost contact with multiple strongpoints. By the time the first assault waves reached the beach, each German position was an island, alone, blind, and deaf. Wolf's own casemate was cut off entirely. He could hear distant gunfire, but had no idea whether his neighboring bunkers were still alive. The wall had become a mosaic of isolated fragments, no longer capable of acting as a unified machine. This was the first major collapse, the collapse of command. The German defense at Omaha depended on accurate observation. Pre-registered artillery fire was only effective if observers could confirm timing and adjust ranges. Machine gun nests relied on forward posts to coordinate strike angles. The naval bombardment systematically removed the eyes of the defense. Observation slits were blocked by debris. Rangefinders were smashed by shock waves. Periscopes shattered. Outlying posts, lightly built, were obliterated. One German officer later recalled, "I could fire, but I did not know at what." The destruction of observation posts created a paradox. The Germans possessed devastating weapons, MG-42s, 88mm guns, mortars, but lacked the ability to aim them effectively. They were powerful, yet functionally crippled. German doctrine on the Atlantic Wall depended heavily on pre-prepared firing plans. Every machine gun team knew their arcs. Mortars had precise grids. Artillery had preset concentrations. The assumption was that when the enemy landed, these plans would overlay the battlefield like a lethal blueprint. But the naval bombardment altered the battlefield. Craters rearranged the terrain. Sand dunes shifted. Barbed wire was torn away. Beach obstacles were destroyed or displaced. Smoke obscured landmarks needed for calibration. Suddenly, the blueprint no longer matched the physical reality. German gunners stared out at a landscape that had changed in minutes. Their prearranged geometry, the mathematical heart of their defense, had disintegrated. It was as if the Atlantic Wall had been designed for a different coastline. Inside the bunkers, the psychological damage ran deeper than the physical. Soldiers were shaking uncontrollably, their ears ringing from concussions, their mouths filled with dust and blood, their skin peppered by fragments of concrete. Many were partially deaf. Some were temporarily blinded. But the most devastating psychological wound was this: they had witnessed the wall fail. Not symbolically, not theoretically, physically. They had seen bunkers collapse. They had felt the ground shift beneath them. They had watched their invincible positions turned into ruins before the landing had even begun. This shattered the defenders' mental equilibrium. German training relied on certainty, certain distances, certain firing lanes, certain orders, certain belief in the wall. When certainty died, fear rushed in to fill its place. For many defenders, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. They had been told the wall could not break. Now they stood inside its fractures. Every military defense requires rhythm, a cadence of action and response. Reload, fire, adjust, observe, communicate. Reload, fire, adjust, observe, communicate. But at Omaha, this rhythm collapsed. A machine gun crew fired until dust clogged the mechanism. A mortar team lost their aiming stakes. An artillery battery never received the signal to begin firing. An 88mm gun position waited for orders that would never come. The German defense became jagged, irregular, chaotic. Volleys of deadly fire punctuated by long intervals of paralysis. This inconsistency was not a tactical choice. It was the symptom of a system dying on its feet. The defenders at Omaha were a mixed force: Wehrmacht coastal infantry, OST battalion conscripts, static division soldiers with limited mobility, veteran NCOs spread thin across too many posts. After the bombardment, some were psychologically shattered, some were physically injured, some were trapped under debris, some fled trenches filled with toxic dust, some were temporarily unconscious. The positions that remained intact were often undermanned. Some bunkers had 2 defenders left, others had none. The wall still looked formidable from the sea, but inside it was hollowed out, manpower scattered, chain of command broken, defenders reeling. The decisive collapse of defensive coherence occurred when the first wave of American infantry landed under fire and survived. German soldiers expected the landing craft to be torn apart. They expected the wall to kill thousands before the invaders reached the sand. They expected the machines of war to do the killing for them. When the American infantry did not break, when scattered survivors slowly crawled up the beach despite the fire, something fundamental shifted. One German machine gunner later wrote, "They kept coming. Even after the wall broke, they kept coming. That was the moment we understood we were lost." The defenders had already lost faith in their fortifications. Now they began losing faith in themselves. Defensive coherence requires confidence. Confidence requires predictability. Predictability died with the first crack in the bunker wall. It is important to emphasize, the collapse of coherence did not mean the Germans ceased fighting. Quite the opposite. Fragmented defenses are often the most dangerous. Isolated bunkers fight independently, holding out longer because they cannot withdraw. Individual machine gun nests became micro-fortresses. Lone snipers held positions for hours. Mortar teams fired until buried alive. The wall had failed as a system, but the individual components fought with brutal tenacity. That is why Omaha Beach became a slaughterhouse. Not because the wall held, but because it broke unevenly. A fractured blade can still cut. A collapsing structure can crush. An uncoordinated defense can still kill thousands. The wall had collapsed, but its ruins were lethal. By midday, when surviving German defenders looked out from their shattered bunkers and saw American infantry reaching the bluffs, something inside them gave way entirely. Not courage, not discipline, not professionalism. Certainty. The sense that their role had been meaningful, that their wall could hold, that the Reich had prepared them, that their leaders had told them the truth. At Omaha Beach, that certainty died, and with it, the psychological backbone of the Atlantic Wall. In the shattered bunkers above Omaha Beach, as dust drifted through fractured ceilings and the smell of pulverized concrete hung in the air like smoke, a deeper collapse unfolded, one not written in steel or stone, but in the minds of the defenders. The German soldiers at Omaha did not simply experience physical bombardment. They experienced a profound psychological unmaking. The Atlantic Wall had not only cracked under fire, it had cracked inside them. For years, the wall had been more than a defensive structure. It had been a promise that engineering could replace manpower, that concrete could compensate for shrinking armies, that a coastline could be defended by geometry and doctrine, rather than divisions and reserves. This promise was ideological, not merely architectural. It was built by Hitler's speeches, by Waffenamt propaganda, by fortress commanders who preached that their casemates were unbreakable monuments to German engineering genius. Many soldiers stationed there were not elite units. They were older conscripts, foreign battalions, and troops rotated from the Eastern Front to recover. The wall was meant to give them confidence they otherwise lacked. When the wall crumbled, that borrowed confidence collapsed with it. Before D-Day, German defenders repeated a simple mantra: "The wall will hold because it must hold." This was not arrogance. It was a coping mechanism. They were stationed far from home, on a coastline they barely understood, with minimal reserves and long stretches of boredom punctuated by anxiety. The belief in the wall's impregnability helped them endure this uncertainty. Like soldiers in ancient fortresses, they anchored their identity to the strength of their walls. But naval shells do not respect belief. A casemate cracked regardless of how many times its defenders had been told it was invincible. When the ceiling shook for the first time, Wolf felt something strange, an emotion he could not immediately name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was doubt. The moment the bunker became something less than permanent, the defenders' confidence became something less than unbreakable. This doubt did not appear gradually. It erupted like a fissure in the concrete, fast, violent, unstoppable. And like the bunker, once cracked, it could not be repaired. The German defenders were not untrained or inexperienced. Many had fought on the Eastern Front. They understood fear, hardship, and the brutality of modern war. But they had never experienced contradiction, a direct violation of everything they had been taught to trust. Their entire defensive philosophy rested on three assumptions. The bunkers will survive any naval fire. The obstacles will slow the enemy. The wall's guns will finish the job. By sunrise, all three assumptions lay in ruins. The bunkers cracked. The obstacles were shredded. The guns were blinded, buried, or crushed. This violation created cognitive dissonance so severe that many defenders temporarily froze. They were not cowards. They were stunned. Their mental model of the battlefield had collapsed. Their minds were still fighting a war that no longer existed. A veteran sergeant later wrote, "It felt as if the ground rules had changed. We were prepared for battle. We were not prepared for the impossible." In war, the collapse of a plan is manageable. The collapse of belief is not. The heavy bunkers of the Atlantic Wall were designed to shelter their occupants. But after hours of bombardment, they became cages. Ventilation clogged with dust. Air turned toxic. Entrances collapsed. Periscopes shattered. Escape routes became death traps. Some defenders suffocated before the Americans even landed. Others clawed at debris, trying to dig their way out of casemates, now half filled with rubble. The psychological effect was suffocating, literally and figuratively. The place that was supposed to protect them now felt like it wanted to bury them alive. One soldier shouted through the dark, "The wall is killing us." This is the most profound irony of Omaha Beach. The defenders were destroyed not only by the enemy, but by their own fortress. German defensive doctrine relied on cohesion, interlocking fields of fire, coordinated artillery support, and a shared sense of purpose. The bombardment severed these bonds. After the shelling, bunkers fought alone. Mortar teams fired blindly. Machine gun nests were isolated islands. Commanders had no way to direct forces. Soldiers could not see or hear each other. Isolation destroys morale faster than casualties. A man can fight bravely beside comrades. Alone in a collapsing bunker, bravery becomes a whisper. Psychologists studying battlefield cohesion have found that the greatest predictor of combat performance is not fortification, training, or equipment. It is interpersonal connection. Omaha's defenders lost that connection in the first 20 minutes of bombardment. The psychological journey of a German defender at Omaha Beach followed a devastating sequence. Confidence. The wall will hold. Confusion. Why is the concrete cracking? Fear. If the bunker breaks, we die. Isolation. No one can help us. Helplessness. We cannot change anything. Resignation. We can only wait. This emotional arc explains why resistance at Omaha was both fierce and fractured. Some defenders fought to the last round, driven by training and adrenaline. Others were psychologically broken before the landing craft even arrived. The wall did not collapse physically in a single blast. It collapsed emotionally in a single moment. The moment its defenders realized the battle was not about courage, but about physics. After the war, surviving German defenders described their experience with a remarkable emotional clarity. They did not speak of strategic mistakes or tactical miscalculations. They spoke of betrayal, not by their officers, but by the belief system that had raised their expectations beyond reality. One survivor said, "We were told the wall was stronger than any fleet. Then the fleet showed us what strength was." The psychological collapse at Omaha was not simply fear of death. It was grief. Grief for a belief they didn't know they had lost until it shattered. Concrete can be replaced. Steel can be reforged. But a myth, once broken, cannot be rebuilt. When the sun finally climbed high above Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, it illuminated a coastline transformed. Smoke drifted like torn curtains across shattered bluffs. Bunkers that had once been monuments of German power slumped open like broken jaws. Concrete sheets, once 2 meters thick, once advertised as eternal, lay peeled back in massive slabs, curled and cracked as though melted by some impossible heat. And within those ruins lay the true legacy of that day. Not simply the defeat of a defensive line, but the collapse of an idea. For years, the Atlantic Wall had been Germany's great psychological fortress, the illusion that engineering could substitute for strategy, that concrete could defeat fleets, that static strength could halt a mobile empire. But naval firepower had exposed this illusion with brutal clarity. The wall, so proudly built and fiercely defended, had not been overcome by human waves, or by elite commandos, or by cunning infiltration. It had been broken open from a distance, dismantled by physics and firepower, before the defenders even saw the faces of the men who would storm the beaches. The shock experienced by the German soldiers at Omaha, the moment when concrete cracked under their feet, revealed a fundamental truth about modern war. Fortresses are no longer defined by what they are, but by what they can endure. The Atlantic Wall could endure little. It only appeared strong because it had never faced the weapons built to challenge it. This is the paradox at the heart of its legacy. Its strength was an illusion upheld by absence. Its impregnability was a myth upheld by time. When the Allies arrived with the full weight of industrial firepower behind them, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, rockets, saturation bombardment, the wall met something it had never been designed to resist: the cumulative force of modern massed naval artillery synchronized with aerial observation and infantry assault. The lesson extended far beyond Normandy. Omaha Beach marked the symbolic death of fortress warfare. Europe's military history had been shaped for centuries by stone walls, citadels, strong points, and defensive lines. But on D-Day, the world watched these legacies crumble in hours. The Atlantic Wall's collapse announced a new era: mobility over immobility, firepower over fortification, industrial scale over architectural ambition. The Germans had believed they were defending a castle. The Allies showed them they were defending a target. From that moment forward, no army would again trust fixed concrete to withstand the fury of modern arms. Even the strongest bunkers on the Eastern Front, the Siegfried Line, and the Pacific Islands would eventually succumb to overwhelming, coordinated fire. The lesson was universal. No structure can remain impregnable when the enemy's firepower multiplies faster than your concrete thickens. For the German soldiers who survived Omaha, the memory was not one of cowardice or failure. It was one of revelation. They had discovered, in the most violent way possible, that they had been fighting a war built on promises that engineering alone could not keep. The shock they felt, watching walls crack, gun embrasures collapse, and ceilings peel downward, became one of the most haunting psychological markers of the war. Many survivors would later admit, "I believed in the Atlantic Wall. On that morning, I stopped believing in the Reich." This was not a surrender of body, but of faith, a fracture in the mythology of Nazi invincibility. Omaha Beach proved that even the strongest walls are useless if the strategy behind them is flawed. It proved that courage cannot substitute for communication. It proved that ideology cannot substitute for preparation. And most of all, it proved that a fortress is only as strong as the force that defends it. The cost paid by the Allies on Omaha Beach was staggering. The bravery displayed there was unforgettable. But beneath the blood, beneath the chaos, beneath the tragic heroism, the deeper narrative is one of confrontation between belief and reality. The German defenders believed they held the unbreakable edge of Europe. Reality arrived in the form of naval shells cracking concrete like sand. The Allies believed they could break through the strongest wall ever built. Reality proved they were right, because they brought with them the full weight of industrial democracy. Omaha Beach was many things: a slaughterhouse, a triumph, a tragedy. But it was also a hinge in military history, a reminder that warfare is no longer a contest of walls, but of will, coordination, and material power. The Atlantic Wall died on June 6th, not because it was weak, but because it was outdated. It died because it belonged to a past age. It died because the world had changed while its builders refused to change with it. And the men inside those bunkers, men like Wolf, felt that death in real time, as their walls crumbled around them and the myth of impregnability turned to dust in their hands. This is the enduring legacy of Omaha Beach, not the defeat of a wall, but the defeat of a belief.